This video examines how the emergence of the modern colonial world system disrupted the traditional ways of being, knowing, and behaving of Muslims in the Atlantic world, as well as how Muslims responded to this disruption. It is the third of 5 videos summarizing the findings from my PhD dissertation entitled Tradition as Flow: Decolonial Currents in the Muslim Atlantic. A statue of Prince Henry the Navigator stands in the middle of a roundabout which connects the main districts of the city of Ceuta, better known in the West by its Spanish name Ceuta. This strategically situated monument serves as a reminder of the city's crucial role in the early stages of Portuguese imperialism. Ceuta sits on the African side of the Gibraltar Strait. From there, the Rock of Gibraltar on the European coast is visible only a few kilometers away. The city, which came under Spanish jurisdiction in 1580, remains one of the few African territories still under direct European rule today. Although the invasion of Ceuta in 1415, under Henry's leadership, is not widely remembered today, it was a major turning point in world history. It launched the African Crusade, during which the Portuguese explored the western coast of Africa and conquered several cities and ports. Their aim was to divert the trade of sub-Saharan gold, ivory, and enslaved captives from the inland caravan routes dominated by Muslims. More ambitiously, they were seeking a passage to India and other parts of Asia, which would circumvent Muslim-ruled lands. Through these actions, Portugal initiated the modern Atlantic slave trade and the Western European age of exploration, conquest, and colonization. It is also important to point out that Ceuta was an important trade hub, allowing the last Muslim dynasty in Granada to access goods coming from Africa and Asia. By conquering Ceuta, the Portuguese cut off this crucial supply route. Across the Gibraltar Strait and a bit further inland, the Spanish city of Granada sits in the beautiful foothills of the Sierra Nevada mountains. Today, at the busy intersection connecting the old and new sections of downtown Granada, one can find the Plaza of Isabella the Catholic. It is named after the 15th century Castilian queen Isabella, whose great-uncle was none other than Henry the Navigator. In the middle of the plaza, there is an imposing monument, which features a sculpture of Christopher Columbus kneeling before Isabella and presenting his plan to sail westwards across the Atlantic. 2 dates are written on the pedestal: January 2nd and October 12th, 1492. The first date corresponds to the conquest of Granada by Catholic forces, and the second to the day Columbus first set foot on American soil. These 2 interconnected events gave birth to the modern colonial world system initially established by Spain and Portugal. The conquest of Granada by Queen Isabella I of Castile and her husband King Ferdinand II of Aragon was the culmination of a major crusade against the Muslims who had ruled over parts of Europe for nearly 8 centuries. After the fall of Granada, all Muslims and Jews who were not killed were eventually expulsed from Spain. The genocide was complete by the early 17th century. Another genocide, whose completion was led by Isabella and Ferdinand, occurred in the Canary Islands in the Atlantic waters off the African coast. The indigenous Guanches were exterminated by Catholic crusaders and conquistadors who saw them as inferior savages. Clearly, when Columbus was mandated by Isabella and Ferdinand to cross the Atlantic, he carried more than a bunch of sailors in his ships. He transported the seeds of genocide. The European encounter of indigenous Americans who had not developed such technologies as the wheel, iron, and gunpowder established an asymmetric power dynamic which would soon evolve into modern colonial racism. Europeans were profoundly transformed by the remarkable ease and speed with which they were able to conquer the American continent, exterminate most of its native inhabitants, and access its enormous resources. Rather than living as marginalized populations, just outside the more prosperous lands ruled by Muslims, Christian European men became the center of a new world system within which they claimed complete sovereignty over all living beings. They increasingly imagined themselves as positioned above the cosmos rather than within it, somewhat like deities. But Christian theology could not allow for such explicit idolatry. Instead, racism arose as an ideological construct which categorized various peoples in a hierarchical order dominated by white, Western European, Christian men. Walter Mignolo informs us that before the conquest of the Americas, the notion of race was first applied to humans rather than horses during the Spanish Inquisition, launched by none other than Ferdinand and Isabella in 1478 to rid the Catholic community of so-called impostors. For example, Catholics with certain physical characteristics, such as dark skin, were suspected of having so-called impure Muslim or Jewish blood. This indicated that they might secretly be worshipping the wrong god. Converts were considered potential religious and political traitors to the cause of making Spain a pure Catholic nation. However, impure blood did not explicitly put into question a person's humanity. The notion of pure Christian blood only became fully racist in the modern sense after it was applied to indigenous Americans. After 1492, Muslims and Jews came to be viewed by Christian Europeans as subhuman rather than simply having the wrong religion. Race rapidly became the organizing factor of human identity in the early modern colonial world system, which expanded by partially or completely exterminating Muslims and Jews in Portugal and Spain, Guanches in the Canary Islands, diverse indigenous American nations, Africans during the transatlantic slave trade, European women accused of witchcraft, and European Roma, pejoratively known as gypsies. Genocidal racism is therefore a constitutive aspect of modernity. Scholars such as Enrique Dussel contend that a decolonial analysis requires looking at our world system from the perspective of the colonized. Eurocentric analyses generally focus on the political and economic motivations of colonial and imperial projects. However, the focus widens if you think of Europeans arriving or coming at you, rather than expanding outwards from inside Europe. If you are an Arawak in the Caribbean or a Mandingo in West Africa, European colonialism and imperialism represent more than a political and economic challenge. They are an existential threat to every aspect of your life, including how you eat, dress, love, think, and worship. From the beginning, Muslims fought back vigorously against this threat. For instance, Andalusians, exiled in North Africa, attacked Spanish and Portuguese ships and raided their shores to capture and enslave Catholic civilians. Interestingly, several of these captives refused to return to Europe even after being ransomed, choosing instead to convert to Islam and continue living with Muslims. In Europe, such converts became known as renegades and ferocious pirates. Nevertheless, in the early modern colonial period, the southern and eastern Mediterranean, most of which was still ruled by Muslims, was progressively forced into a peripheral position in relation to Atlantic European powers. Conquests in America gave Western Europe a huge economic advantage against the Ottomans and other Muslim empires. From the mid-17th to the mid-19th centuries, which I consider the second phase of modernity, England, France, and the Netherlands moved to the core of the world system, relegating Portugal and Spain to the semi-periphery. Nelson Maldonado Torres argues that during this period, secularism gradually replaced Christianity as the hegemonic modern colonial discourse. This transition from a theocentric to an anthropocentric and secular worldview can be traced all the way back to Renaissance humanism. It allowed certain white men to fully affirm their sovereignty over the universe and imagine they could practically replace a god they increasingly depicted as a big white man in the sky. This ideological shift reinforced the racial power dynamics of the modern colonial world system. Ramon Grossfogel puts it bluntly when he writes, "During the last 510 years of the capitalist, patriarchal, Western-centric, Christian-centric, modern colonial world system, we went from the 16th century Christianize or I shoot you, to the 19th century civilize or I shoot you, to the 20th century develop or I shoot you, to the late 20th century neoliberalize or I shoot you, and to the early 21st century democratize or I shoot you." Naturally, people racialized as subordinate and disposable have fought back. There are so many stories of resistance I would like to share with you here. I would like to tell you about Sayyid al-Hurra, an Andalusian who became governor of the Moroccan city of Tétouan and eventually Queen of Morocco. She was known by her Spanish and Portuguese enemies as the Pirate Queen because of the intense naval wars she led against them. I would like to tell you about the Moroccan, Mustafa al-Azammouri, who was the first non-indigenous person to travel the lands from Florida to Mexico. I want you to know that the first colonial settler in Brooklyn, New York was a Muslim called Anthony Van Sally. I would like to tell you about how West African Muslims reorganized their societies in response to the devastating transatlantic slave trade through a series of Islamic revolutions whose fighters occasionally ended up in the Americas. I would like to tell you of the many slave revolts led by Muslims in the Americas over centuries, culminating in the Haitian Revolution. In 1804, Haiti became the first modern nation-state founded by former slaves. Among the leaders of the revolution, I would love to tell you about François Macandal, a West African Muslim warrior who killed thousands of slave owners and established a strategic vision to end white supremacy on the island. Perhaps I will produce some more videos after this series in which I tell these stories, but for now, I invite you to read my dissertation to find out more about the ongoing resistance to colonial rule in the Muslim Atlantic. I also invite you to stay posted for the next video in this series, which discusses how traditionalism is one reaction to the colonial disruption in the Muslim Atlantic. Until then, salam.